So I want to ask you a question again this week, as I often do. Does life ever feel out of control? Never, right? Never has, never will, right? So never had it, never will. Was that 7-Up, I think that was, right? Caffeine, right? Never had it, never will. Because life just kind of works that way, right? That, there are times where there are specific things that are out of control. It might be work, it might be family, it might be church, it might be your relationships. Sometimes it feels like all those things get out of control. And what do we want? When that happens, right? When it feels like everything is out of control, what do we want to do more than anything? If I could just get control of all these things, then everything would be fine. Because that kind of makes sense, right? That if I could just get control of everything, because if I was in charge, it would all be fine. Are you laughing specifically because of Jim being in charge, or are you asking because you might be in charge? It's kind of interesting is that a number of years ago, I had a friend who was actually working towards becoming a certified psychologist. And she had to do all of her university work to get her doctorate, but she also had to do a lot of practical work. And she would go through, kind of like internships where she would spend time in different institutions working with patients with mental health needs. And she shared with me that at one point as she was kind of reaching the end, towards the end of her program, and she's kind of more advanced in her studies, she's got more experience working with patients, that her rotation was in this one particular hospital that had some of the folks who had just very difficult mental illness issues. And just to kind of set the stage, at this point she's in her 20s, and she kind of stood out. She was kind of tall, she was very thin, she had very short blonde hair, and she would kind of stand out when she walked in somewhere. And so as she walked in, now keep in mind, she's got to be buzzed in, right? So this is a secure facility. They got to buzz her through a series of doors before she reaches the patients. And as she walks in, one patient just spots her, runs at her as fast as he can, gets in her face, and just starts screaming as loud as he possibly can. Now, she had a lot of experience with mental health folks dealing with mental health issues at this point, but she had never dealt with anything like this before. And reflexively, she just kind of backed up, and she let him back her into a corner. And he just stood there, never touching her, screaming in her face nonstop. As finally she kind of gets herself away, gets to a room separate, and she admits it, she kind of sat down and cried for a while. She didn't know how to deal with that. So she finishes her shift, goes through her next day, comes in, report in the next day, walks to the door. This time, he's waiting by the door and does exactly what he did the day before. Just starts screaming in her face. And this happens day after day. He waits for her to walk through the door. And she shared with me that, she kind of, after a few days of that, she just didn't know if she could do this anymore. And she kind of iterated, through her decision process with me, like what could she do here? I mean, she can't really get control of this gentleman, right? He's got a severe mental health issue. You can't explain to him that his behavior is not appropriate. That's just not going to work. Technically she probably could have talked to a supervisor, but she's the person studying to become one of those supervisors. So someone's going to look to her to say, well, how do you deal with this issue? What would you do in this situation? The alternative is to quit. Spent years of her life working towards something, and just to say, you know what? I just have to quit. Well, she felt that she was meant to do this, that she'd worked really hard to do this. She's just like, well, I can't control the person. I can't control the situation. I can't control the requirements that I need to get my certification. But there is one thing I can control: how I respond to this situation. The one thing that I can control is how I respond to the situation. So she decided that the way to respond was to know that she's going to walk through the door, he's going to scream at her, and just keep walking. Do not let his behavior interrupt what you're doing. And as she shared with me, the first day she tried to do it, it was, through gritted teeth, but she just kept walking. And he kept screaming, but eventually he just stayed behind screaming, and she carried on. The next day she comes in, she's got a little more practice, she does a little better, but he keeps screaming. And I would love to tell you that the outcome of this story is that because she stopped paying attention to him, he stopped screaming, He never stopped screaming. But you know what did stop happening? She stopped letting the outside events in. She stopped letting his screaming disrupt her own experience. I mean, sure, she would have rather not had that experience, but as time went on, she focused on what she had to do. And she kept that in mind, and ultimately, became, as far as I know, fairly successful in her career. Because the thing is that she found peace not by gaining control, but by recognizing that she could not control the whole thing, but she could control herself. And what I want to kind of extend to you today as an idea is that maybe the way that we have greater peace in our lives is to recognize that life is something that we cannot control. In fact, as we continue our series here that we've called Missing Peace, what I would like to suggest is the way that we have greater peace in our lives is to be willing to be out of control. To recognize that the very nature of life is outside of our control. We can't control what happens with our health. I mean, we can take care of ourselves to a point, but some things just happen. We can't control the way people around us behave. As we talked about last week, this, being obsessed with politics. The control that you have in politics is you cast your vote. It comes out how it comes out. And so in the fall, when the election doesn't go the way you want, whatever way that is, are you going to walk around for the next 4 years giving up all that you could do with your lives, just being angry about it? Or are you going to say, what can I control? I can control what I do in this situation. I can control what I do with my life. So what I would like to suggest is that we find ourselves in a situation, or in a time frame, I should say, where there's more turmoil in life. We've talked about that a ton. Life has more turmoil than it did a few decades ago. We can argue over the reasons, but we don't need to argue over the fact that it's true. We do. And the thing that we're trying to do all the time is gain control, getting people to bend to our wills, behave the way we want them to want some situation to be different. And what I would argue is that we're trying to gain control because we believe that if we can gain control, we'll have more peace in our lives. But I would argue, though, is that the very thing that we're doing to try to gain peace is what's disrupting our peace. It's this attempting to do something that you are never going to be able to do. You can't control everyone, and you shouldn't. You can't control every situation. So you have a choice about how you live out your life. Because I think that this desire to have control over things, I think it's natural. I think almost all of us do it, so there must be something natural about that. But what I think it does is it takes our eyes off of something that's really important. That if we're spending all of our time and all of our energy trying to gain control over people or situations or events or whatever, we miss something that's really important. We're actually missing something we can do. So I want to do this morning is look at just a couple of verses written by the Apostle Paul that I think actually help us see where we could put our focus to make a real difference in our own experience as well as what we do. So Paul tells us that there's something that it's easy for us to get. And he writes this in a letter to a church in Rome. Paul says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." So it says that God works for the good of all those who love him. Another way it might be able to say that is that God works for the good of all those who put their faith in Jesus. So I'm going to ask you a question. If you are someone who has put your faith in Jesus, think back to the day you first believed, wherever that is. Has your life been absolutely good since then? Nothing bad has happened since that day? Man, it clicked, Prosperity gospel is true, right? That, I believed and everything was good and perfect from that moment on. Is there anyone who has had that experience? Because I haven't had that experience. I think my life is, overall pretty good. I got a wife who doesn't realize what an idiot I am, and she stays married to me, so that helps, right? Right? The reality is that, just because you believe, your life didn't suddenly get perfect and good. Again, a number of you are dealing with really serious issues. So does Does Paul just get it wrong? Did Paul hit his head before he wrote this down? Or maybe he's thinking of something different. Maybe his definition of good is maybe a little different than we might think at first. Because if we look at the verse a little bit more closely, Paul gives us an indication of what he thinks of as good. Because remember he said that God works for the good of those called according to God's purpose. That when you put your faith in Jesus, you became part of something bigger than yourself. That you became part of God's ultimate purpose. That means that in your life, God is working, moving you towards his ultimate purpose. And all that time we spend spun up and angry is all time we don't spend engaging with what God's trying to do inside of us. Because you are part of God's ultimate purpose in life. You have a personal purpose that fits into what God is doing in the world. And what I think it's important for us to understand is that God is kind of working in things in kind of what I'll call a cycle, for lack of a better word, in the sense that God kind of initiates things through his Holy Spirit, working towards his end goal, his ultimate purpose. But he chooses to do it through us. And in order to do things through us, he first has to do something else. He's moving to do something in us. That when we put our faith in Jesus, right, the Apostle Paul tells us that the Holy Spirit takes up residence in us when we put our faith in Jesus. And what's happening is as we think of this idea of God doing a good work in us, he's moving us towards something. And so right after Paul makes this statement, he tells us something more that actually gives us some more insight in what he means by good. So Paul continues, he says, "For God knew his people in advance and chose them to become like his Son, so that his Son, in other words, so that Jesus would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters." So Paul is saying that when you put your faith in God, God is working to make you like his Son, to make you kind of like Jesus. What God is doing within us, what his Spirit is doing in us, is he's doing this work within us to move our hearts and our minds to be more like that of Jesus. And if you're like me, that is a long road, right? You know, it's in fits and sputters, right? You do well for a while and you go backwards for a while. You exhibit mercy in situations that you amaze yourself that you do it. But other times you blow your top over small things, right? But that's the process, is that as we talk about God doing a work within us, what God is doing is his Spirit is moving in us to help us to think more the way Jesus does, and to evolve a heart and mind more like that of Jesus. That, in effect, what God is trying to do is to remake us in the image of Jesus. And there's something that's really important to remember. I'm going to say it twice, so I don't think it made it clear the first time I say it, so I'll say it twice. God is more interested in who you become than what you do. God is more interested in who you become than what you do. So does that mean we just kind of sit in the corner, and I'll just meditate on my own and, we'll go cloister myself and lock myself away? But what are the things that most impact who you become? The things you do. Again, it's kind of like a cycle, right? Is that God is leading us towards developing the heart and mind of Jesus, but the way we live that out is by the things we do. Right? That when we take actions that are consistent with the actions of Jesus, and we behave in a way that's consistent with the behavior of Jesus, that begins to reshape who we are. So there's this continuing cycle that's happening inside of us all the time, that the Holy Spirit of God is moving inside of us, moving our hearts and minds to be more like Jesus. But if we just sit with that, we don't move very far. But when we take action consistent with the heart and mind of Jesus, that shapes us a bit more. And so our heart and minds become more like Jesus, and we do more like Jesus. That our growth, our kind of cycle, is to go through this kind of repeatedly to become more and more like Jesus, even though we will get it wrong a lot. And that's okay. And even though we felt like we were doing so well, we thought we finally conquered that thing, we thought that thing was finally behind us, and we fall down again, we're still moving closer to the heart and mind of Jesus. Because what God is doing is that, remember that you are part of the larger purpose of God, which means that you have an individual purpose. And in living out your purpose means that you allow him to work within you to change your mind and heart to be more like Jesus. You take actions consistent with that, and that begins to have you working in your purpose. I've said this a bazillion times, I'll say it more. You were created on purpose with a purpose. There is something God is calling you into. And as we're trying to develop more and more the heart and mind of Jesus, we have to be willing to take those actions consistent with our purpose. And the infamous thing is that, what if you don't know what your purpose is? Right? You got this kind of big, kind of existential question, what is my purpose in life? I don't know. But I will tell you that in any situation, there's a right thing to do. There's a godly thing to do. There's a Christ-like action in any situation that you can take. It may be as simple as the way you speak to a customer service representative, because we're all tempted to go off the rails there, right? But in that moment, when you choose to treat that person as a person, you're being Christ-like. The way that we discover what God is calling us towards, the way we discover God's purpose in our lives, for most of us, I do not believe, is to go lock ourselves away and just meditate for years. I think the way most of us find our purpose is by doing that next right thing, that next thing in front of us, that chance to act in a Christ-like way in a moment. That's how we start to discover it, because God will use that. So as we think of this idea of having peace and finding control in our lives and wanting to control all these other things, what we find is that when we're trying to control everyone else, we lose sight of our purpose. So what can we control? What's the one thing we can control? Ourselves. That if we will take our energy off of wanting to control everyone else and everything else and instead say, I'm going to control the things in my life that relate to me. I'm going to control my attitude. I'm going to control my outlook. I'm going to trust that God is bigger than the circumstance I'm dealing with. I'm going to actually control my emotional responses. Yes, that customer service representative may be really upsetting you right now, but blowing your top on the phone at them is not going to get you anywhere. In fact, it may get you further down the line, right? But at a minimum, it does nothing. But maybe you could actually be part of something positive in that person's life. Who knows what the impact of that could be? But I know it will have an impact on you, that when I personally find myself about to blow my top, when I take that moment and say, I'm not going to do that. I wish I could control this, I can't, but I can control what I say and what I do. It changes my experience. It actually increases my peace in life. That, this is a horrible thing to say, but if for no other reason, be nice to people because it's better for you. Right? You give a greater sense of peace if you treat people better. And who knows, God might even work in that. The thing is that as we look at the interactions in our life and the things that we want to do, we are tempted constantly to want to tell people how it is or tell people what they should do. And when someone's creates a difficult situation for us, we're tempted to want to engage. But the Apostle Paul tells us that's not the way to operate. What the Apostle Paul tells us is this: do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live in peace with everyone. So looking at those couple of verses, Paul he's saying something kind of indirectly. He's saying you to expect difficult circumstances, right? If he didn't have to remind you to live at peace with everyone as much as it depends on you, well, that means he thought everyone would be peaceful anyway. He's saying when people aren't peaceful with you, be peaceful with them anyway. He even talks about evil, right? When someone does something that you feel is evil, is bad, is harmful, don't repay that with evil and harm. So basically, Paul is saying is that, you know what? Life's going to be difficult sometimes. But the way you live out your purpose in life includes being peaceful, engaging in an appropriate way. And to be clear, right, that doesn't mean that we're trying to be people pleasers. That's not what Paul is saying at all. But what Paul is saying that in every situation, you have a choice to react or to act. And Paul is saying, choose to act. Don't be baited into reaction. Because reactions generally aren't very good, right? But our actions are things we choose in advance and do deliberately. It's going to be deliberately. Reactions kind of blow up out of us. Reactions are things we choose to do specifically. And so as we think about this idea of living as Paul talks about, right, this is about recognizing that you truly do have a purpose and that you are called to live it out. And that when we find ourselves in challenging situations, we've got to decide what we're going to do, right? We're not going to decide to try to gain control of it. We're going to try to control ourselves. Because I would invite you to do this, that next time you find yourself in a difficult situation, consider this possibility. Maybe God's at work in that moment. That maybe God's giving you the opportunity to evaluate your response, to evaluate your emotions, to say, what could I do here to make this situation different? Maybe that's what he's doing. At least consider that possibility. Or what about when you're dealing with a difficult person? I mean, how many times you were like, would they just shut up? That's desire for control, in case you're wondering, right? Or if they would just do the thing I asked them to the way I asked them to do it. Would they just do that? And that's all the desire for control. Now, if that's your surgeon, yeah, you want them to do it the right way, right? But in most of life, it's just kind of people being people. And so, what if we said, what could I do to make this moment different? As that person is being difficult, as that person is getting spun up, what could I do to make this moment different? And the way we do that is by exercising the one bit of control that we have. Now, as many of you know, I'm a big believer in the 12-step process started by the Alcoholics Anonymous. For those who don't know me, I got into ministry by doing recovery work in prison, so I spent a lot of time kind of in that space. And the Christ-like wisdom that flows out of the 12 steps is like immeasurable, like seriously. And one of my favorite sayings of the 12-step world is keep your side of the street clean. Now, what does that mean? Well, the way I hear it, the way I picture it, is that I imagine an old classic main street with lots of independently owned businesses down both sides of the street. And I own my little business, and I look out the window, and the guy across the street, his windows are dirty, and there's garbage on his sidewalk, and he's not picking things up. And I can just sit in my little store, and I can sit and complain and talk about him and how bad he is. But what's happening all the time I'm doing that? I'm not taking care of my side of the street. What if I, instead of complaining about him and talking about him, simply go grab my broom and just sweep my side of the street? If I do nothing more to tend my side of the street, I mean, maybe I'll be the only clean store and everybody will shop there. That's a possibility. Or maybe as I clean my side of the street, my next door neighbors clean their part of the sidewalk. And next thing I know, the whole thing is clean. Or maybe it's not. And it's not up to me. I can't control that. The only thing I can control is the part of the street that I clean. The only thing that you can control in your life, the one and only thing. Parents, can you control your children? Children, can you control your parents? Husbands, can you control your wives? Wives can control their husbands. That's an outlier. That's a special situation, right? But for most of us, we can't control anyone but ourselves. Yet we spend all this energy trying to control other people, wishing that we could control other people. My friends, God has called you into a life of purpose. Every time we are hanging on to anger towards other people, every time that we are complaining about other people, every time we are arguing with other people, every time we sit quietly while boiling inside about other people, we are taking our eyes off the unique purpose that God has for you. So all I'm asking you to do is to consider the possibility that maybe in any difficult circumstance that you find yourself in, that maybe a part of your purpose might be to be the one calming element in a difficult moment. I mean, imagine if we all just did our best to do that. Again, knowing we are not Jesus, we're not going to pull it off perfectly. That's okay. Get it right 1 out of 10 times. You're still going to be a standout, right, sort of thing. Right, so just recognize that you are called to purpose. And all this time that we spend being spun up about other people and other things, we are ignoring our purpose, and we're sacrificing our own peace, our own opportunity to engage in this life in a way that we actually enjoy. Imagine that, waking up today and enjoying today. Because I want to engage in peace. I'm going to engage in the process. I'm going to trust that maybe in each situation I'm in is not a surprise to God. And there's something I can do in that moment. If we will just recognize that the only control that we really have is over ourselves, let's take that control and do something with it.